Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your lunches. There's certainly a lot of clinking of cutlery and crockery, which is an excellent indication it's a good lunch. My name is Tom Russ. I'm a psychiatrist in Edinburgh. Well, as of the start of this month, I'm based in the University of Edinburgh rather than the National Health Service, but it makes little difference. But I'm here to talk about the environment. And coming from Scotland, we have a lovely environment. I'm not actually working for the Scottish Tourist Board, but I may as well be. Edinburgh, come on holiday there. We've got beautiful landmarks. We've got beautiful cliffs. On the bottom right corner is, I don't actually live on this street, but I do live around the corner from this. And Circus Lane was recently voted the 6th most beautiful street in the world. I'm not quite sure how they work these things out, but come and visit. It's lovely. And one of my favourite places is Ullapool in the Northwest Highlands. So there's a lovely environment in Scotland. So come and see. But I'm going to say a little bit about the environment in relation to dementia. Following on, the programme is very nicely devised today, going from the very broad to the very narrow. So I'm somewhere in the middle. And I'm going to talk about the what, the why, and the which. So what causes dementia, which we've already heard a little bit about, why study environmental risk factors, and which environmental risk factors should be concerned about. So starting with the what, we were all obviously very pleased recently with the announcement of a successful disease-modifying therapy trial for dementia. And some of you may have seen the headlines that came out. This is a few years old now, but I do love the headline. And I always like to mention that this particular trial was sponsored by Mars. So you have to take conflicts of interest into account when you're interpreting the media. A much more reliable publication is The Lancet, and we've already heard a lot about the Lancet commissions and the fabulous diagrams, which you can't actually well, this is the first time I saw them successfully put on a single slide by Jill. So I've used PowerPoint magic to hopefully make it slide. And air pollution was added as one of the risk factors in the 2020 Lancet Commission, which I thought was an excellent move. But one of the things I particularly like about this figure, I've moved it off behind here, is the fact that it's distinguishing between the potentially modifiable and the risk unknown, because there's still a lot about dementia that we don't understand. And one of the things I particularly like about the approach taken in the Lancet Commission is the life course focus, the fact that at different stages in life, different things may be important. And that is sometimes lost in policy messaging that's a bit too simplistic, because the same thing isn't true for everyone, but similarly, the same thing isn't true for every stage of life. So I'll move on to talk a little bit about why study environmental risk factors. So I came to environmental risk factors through studying geographical variation in dementia. And if you'll indulge me, I'll share with you my favorite paper on geographical variation. So this is this a pointer? Yep. So this is Newfoundland in Canada, and this area here is Bonavista Bay, which is blown up here. If any of you have read the novel The Shipping News or seen the film, this is where it's set. And this figure is taken from this paper from the early 90s, and each of these little black dots is the birthplace of somebody who died in 1987 or 1988 with dementia. So this researcher went through all the records, found everybody who died with dementia, and found out where they died. And you can see there are many more black dots on the north side of Bonavista Bay than on the south side of Bonavista Bay. And there seems to be a north-south difference here. And back in the 90s, it was more difficult to look at genetic factors, but very enterprisingly, they looked at shared surnames to see if there could be some issue of relatedness, which means there's a particular cluster here. But there does seem to be a real difference between the people who are born on the north side compared to the south side. And it's important they looked at where they were born as well, because people with dementia often die in institutions, in care homes. So if you map where people with dementia die, you get very accurate maps of care homes and hospitals. But here we're looking at where they were born. So we looked at a similar question in I've got endless maps I can show you, but I had to choose my favorite. This one is Sweden, and this was using the Swedish twin studies, where they incredibly robustly ascertained of all the Swedish twins over the age of 65 who had developed dementia. And because they're twins, we could take that fact into account with the modeling. So essentially, not to blind you with science, we could take out the genetic stuff. And what we've got left here is everything that's left, which is likely to be the environmental factors and a few other things as well. But there's still much more noticeable for women, but a similar magnitude of effect for men. There's still a big difference in dementia risk based on where you live. And in Sweden, it was 2 to 3 times higher, the risk of dementia in the north compared to the south. And that's a pattern we see in lots of places. We've seen it in Scotland, we see it in Italy too. And it was this variation, once you've taken out the genetic factors, that led me on to thinking about environmental risk factors. And that's why we moved on to explore that. So essentially, this is pointing to some of that 60% of unexplained risk on the Lancet Commission diagram. There's still more that we can understand about dementia. So that does beg the question, which environmental factors should we be looking at? I've been terribly self-indulgent in this talk, and I hope you don't mind me sharing another headline. This was actually one of our papers, and it's not often that epidemiology makes the front page of a newspaper, and this is the one that my mother-in-law takes, so she was very proud. But this is an article we wrote a few years ago, a systematic review looking at all the literature published on environmental risk factors, and this is the slightly more scientific way to present it. You can look up the details of it if you want, but the point I'll highlight is there's a massive limitation with approaching what environmental risk factors we should be concerned about by looking at the literature, because by definition, we can only look at risk factors that somebody has studied. If somebody's published something, we can look at it, but if they haven't, then we can't look at it. So we came up with a number of risk factors that seem to be important based on the literature, but there may well be other things that are important that we just couldn't look at because nobody had studied them. Nevertheless, I will summarize some of the environmental risk factors, which are potentially the most important, and I'll briefly discuss these. And thinking about the fact that we're thinking about policy here, it's important to point out that some of these risk factors and some of the risk factors in the Lancet Commission are to do with personal choice. It's not an easy choice for me necessarily if I smoke or if I don't smoke. It's not easy to stop if I do smoke, but there's an element of personal choice there. But with some things, it's not so much my choice. So exposure to air pollution, for instance, yes, I can choose where I live. Yes, I can choose where I travel and whether or not I wear a mask. I would have to shave my beard for it to be effective. But policy is much more important in a lot of these areas. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to raise these issues today. So I'm going to briefly talk about rural living compared to living in cities, air pollution. I'm not actually going to talk about smoking, but there's an important link between those, and smoking when you're exposed to air pollution seems to be even worse for you. Talk about some elements, aluminium fluoride, less about silicon today, about vitamin D levels, and I'm not going to have time to talk about pesticides and electromagnetic fields, but there are all sorts of other things which seem to be linked with dementia, which are important to be aware of. Before I move into the next slide, I'm just going to give you a trigger warning. It's very small and it looks very complicated, but I'm going to talk you through it. So bear with me. This is the work of one of my PhD students who's extremely bright, and you will understand this in 1 minute's time, I promise. So this is, it's called a forest plot, partly because it looks a bit like a forest, or sometimes you can't see the forest because of the trees. But each of these lines is one article which has looked at the effect of living in a rural area or an urban area on your risk of getting dementia. And what we've done in putting them in the list is put the ones that were done in high-income countries in the top half, where the red bar is here, and then the lower half are ones that are done in low to middle-income countries, because it seemed to make sense to separate those out. On the right-hand side, the little lozenges or the little grey bars are the individual results, and if one of the results is to the left of the line, like this one, it means it's more risky to be living in an urban area. So cities are worse. And if it's on this side of the line, it means it's worse to be living in a rural area. So cities are better. It's worse being in a rural area. And this is the overall effect here. Overall, it seems to be slightly worse. But actually, statistically speaking, we wouldn't be too confident about this, to slightly worse to be in a rural area. But, and this is why we divided it into the high-income countries and low to middle-income countries. If you look at high-income countries, and you put all the results together, there's no difference at all. There doesn't seem to be an effect of whether you live in a rural area or an urban area in high income countries, but in low to middle income countries, it does cross the line. So again, statistically, we're a bit unsure, but there's certainly a difference between these two in low to middle income countries, that there seems to be an effect of rurality. So this is my student's PhD work. It's very preliminary, but this hasn't been done before. So I think this really does mean that this is something that we should be looking at, because what is it about rural living? It could be to do with access to health services. There could be all sorts of things, but explanations would come later. I'm particularly interested in air pollution, but I'm going to try not to talk about it very much at all, because we're hearing from an expert rather than an amateur in a moment. But I'm just going to give you my edited highlights. To anybody who's interested, who has no scientific training or anything, I would highly recommend this article to you, The Polluted Brain in Science in 2017. It's written for a general audience. It summarizes, fair enough, it's a few years old now, but it summarizes the field beautifully. It's very readable, and it really gives you a good overview of how air pollution could affect the brain and lead to dementia. So it's focusing on the group at the University of Southern California, the AirPol Brain Group, who are particularly interesting because they often bring together fundamental science using animals and epidemiological models, and bring them together and publish them together because they complement each other very nicely. The Alzheimer Society in England and Wales, or the UK, depending on how you slice it, published a report on air pollution and dementia a few years ago now, and this is the way they summed it up. We don't really know, and I think that's a fair summary. There's a lot of associations. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. It's almost, I used to say that I haven't come across a paper that doesn't show a link. There are one or two now that seem to be more equivocal, but we're not quite there. And I'm going to stop myself from boring you with the 3 questions I think need to be answered, because that's a talk for another day. But the INSPIRE consortium that I'm part of has tried to map the what's needed from a policy agenda. And I'm not expecting you to read this. All I want to do is show you how complicated this is. So air pollution policy is hugely complicated, but the health impacts of it on dementia and respiratory disorders and all sorts of things could be massive, and is a real urgent area for policy reform, I think. Back to maps, which I love maps, and they seem to go down well in talks as well. So you'll all know this. This is Scotland. The box here, I've not put in the blown up areas, but this is Edinburgh, this is Glasgow in the west. The Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland. Shetland get very upset if you put them in a little box to move them down. So I'm trying to respect their wishes and have them separately on the map. Incidentally, this morning I was at the what is it called, the museum, the House of European History, and I was reminded that on the euro coins and all these things, the Northern Isles don't feature at all, which I think was perhaps one of the reasons why Brexit may have happened. No, I'm sure it had nothing to do with it. Anyway, so these maps are based on Scottish water data. So these are based on the we're lucky in Scotland, we have a state run essentially supplier of water, so you can find out the concentrations of everything from all the different supplies. So this is levels of aluminium, and this is levels of fluoride in water, and these are data from 2012, I think. The scale along the bottom here goes up to 70. So the guidance for what is safe levels for aluminium is up to about 100. So the levels in Scotland are fantastic. So when I published this paper, I was contacted by a bottled water company asking me if I'd like a case of bottled water, which I thought I'd better refuse, but because the tap water is so good in Scotland anyway. But my point is that even with these very low, very safe levels of aluminium, if we divide up the levels of aluminium into 4 groups, so this is the lowest quarter, and this is the highest quarter, and compare the risk of dementia in the different groups, as you go up the concentrations of aluminium in women and in men, the risk of dementia is raised, even at these safe levels. So aluminium is added to water for many reasons, and it's added for purification purposes, and as I say, these are very safe levels. Fluoride can affect the absorption of aluminium in the body, and it seems to be certainly that, again, even within safe levels of fluoride, being exposed to high levels of fluoride, which is added to protect teeth as well, does seem to increase your risk of dementia. So these things are complicated, because things that are very good from one health perspective, like helping dental health, which is really important, might potentially have some knock-on effects that could be less helpful. I'm going to quickly touch on vitamin D deficiency. So it's linked to sunlight and beautiful days like this. Hopefully all of us are boosting our levels of vitamin D. Some countries supplement foods, some recommend supplements. So in Scotland, we're recommended to take 10 micrograms of vitamin D during the winter. And epidemiologists are suspicious because the low vitamin D levels have been linked with pretty much everything, which from an epidemiological perspective is a little bit suspicious. But, and dementia is one of the things it's been linked with. I'm not going to go into the details of what Mendelian randomization is, but it's a really exciting scientific technique that means you can be a bit more confident in whether or not an association between two things is causal. And it leads many people, including me, to conclude that there does seem to be a causal association between low vitamin D levels and dementia. And this is very exciting. Normally, when I give this a talk along these lines, I can say, but nobody's looked at supplementation about whether if you replace people's vitamin D levels, what that does. But now they have. So there's just one study that's been published, but it found that if your vitamin D levels are low and you take a supplement, that seems to reduce dementia risk to a significant degree. So low vitamin D levels do seem to be important. So in conclusion, I've talked a little bit, a whistle-stop tour about what causes dementia, building on Jill's excellent presentation about the Lancet Commission. I hope I've made a good case for why one should study environmental risk factors and why they should be considered in policy context as well. And I've given you a selection of environmental risk factors which seem to me to be important. I think air pollution is high up the list. Aluminium levels in drinking water, I think is an area for more debate, but does seem to be linked with dementia. Vitamin D levels similarly. But thank you very much for your attention today.